I saw this ranking today from Barton Simmons of 24/7 Sports, and I had to take a minute to talk about it. He ranked the top 25 coaches in college football, and I was particularly curious about this because, obviously, coming off a national championship, you would assume that Ed Orgeron would have ascended many of these lists, and he did. Number one on the list, as you might imagine, was Nick Saban. And Nick, of course, with his 6 national titles, is still the standard bearer in college football, even though he lost to Ed Orgeron and LSU, as did everybody else that played Ed Orgeron and LSU this year. But Barton Simmons has Nick Saban of Alabama, number 1. And he's got Dabo Swinney, number 2. And Dabo, of course, lost to Ed Orgeron in the national championship game, as did everybody else that played LSU this year. But you don't have to go any further to find Coach O. Third on the list, Ed Orgeron. Barton Simmons writes of 247 Sports, last year when I was asked to rank all 65 Power 5 head coaches, I had Orgeron outside the top 40. And in terms of his resume at the time, it's pretty hard to argue he should have been higher. What a difference a year can make. The difference between this year and last year is arguably the best team in college football history. He writes, so I'm rewarding Orgeron for putting together that roster, that coaching staff, and allowing them to play with that level of fearlessness and passion. Every player seems to love playing for him, and every coach seems to love coaching for him, and the man can recruit. Sometimes it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. I think that's just about perfect, the way Barton Simmons wrote it up. If you're wondering, Kirby Smart 4, Lincoln Riley 5, James Franklin of Penn State 6. That surprised me. Although he did great work at Vanderbilt, it seems like he's not quite met the level of expectations some had for him when he showed up there at Happy Valley. But nonetheless, James Franklin 6, Ryan Day 7, Dan Mullen 8, Jimbo Fisher, national championship winning coach, down at 9, and then Brian Kelly at 10. The other SEC coaches in the top 25, Gus Malzahn at 13, Mark Stoops at 15. Mark Stoops is getting a lot of praise for the job he's done. And credit Kentucky for the patience they showed sticking with Mark Stoops to allow him the opportunity to build that program to where they can be a consistent winner. Jeremy Pruitt at 21. Boy, that win streak to end the season certainly helped. And then Mike Leach at Mississippi State, 25, rounding out the top 25. But I couldn't help but notice, and this isn't so much just about the list and one man's opinion of ranking the coaches in college football, but what was so stark is the contrast in perception and reality, which are intertwined at times, what they were 3 years ago and how it's morphed. Today, I spent some time when I saw this, and I went back and I searched some of these coaching rankings to see where Ed Orgeron was each of the 3 years. And just to illustrate how much this has changed. Every year before the season, Athlon ranks all 130 head coaches in college football. 1 to 130. In 2017, Ed Orgeron was 81 on the list. You literally had coaches I had never heard of. Some guy from Toledo. Terry Bowden at Akron was ranked higher than Coach O was in 2017. A year later, remember, they had some bumpy roads in 2017. Troy lost, blowout at Mississippi State, ugly loss in the bowl game to Notre Dame. They started 2018, Orgeron 81st again. Exceeded a lot of expectations in 2018. They started last year with Coach O as the 51st. You raised him 30 spots, 51. Then he puts together the best season in the history of college football. College Football News does their rankings at the end of the season. So at the end of the 2017 season, he was 45. At the end of 2018, he was 7. And at the end of this past season, they had him ranked first. So you could tell College Football News did a wise thing of waiting to the end of seasons to do rankings. And they caught the bug, for sure. Gridiron Now, a website which is now defunct that I wrote for. The editor at Gridiron Now did a piece, the top 20 worst hires in the history of college football. Ed Orgeron was on the list. Ed Orgeron to LSU was on the list. Top 20 worst hires of all time. And that was before he coached a game full-time. I dug up this piece of audio as well. After the 2017 coaching carousel spun Paul Feinbaum and Booger McFarland, were on SportsCenter, and they were asked to give their worst hires of that offseason. Here's what Feinbaum said.
I could go a lot of places, but sadly, I'm going to Ed Orgeron at LSU.
Paul.
I know Booger likes it, and I like Ed, but I just think they could have done much better. That's really where it lies here. They swung for the fences, and I think they settled. And that's not what you're supposed to do when you fire a Hall of Fame coach in Les Miles and you go through Jimbo Fisher and Tom Herman and many others. I also think he would have liked to have had Lane Kiffin as the offensive coordinator. Canada is a good coordinator, but I'm somewhat underwhelmed here, Bug.
That was Feinbaum in 2017. For what it's worth, Booger's choice for the worst hire in 2017, Matt Rule at Baylor. I think that one kind of worked out okay, too. And listen, before any of you do it, I'll point the finger at myself as well. We all know what I felt about the hire. But the illustration here is that if you were a die-hard LSU homer, you were in that let's go get them category, okay. The overwhelming majority of the rest of the college football-loving world looked at this hire and went, what the hell are you doing? And I was in that number, for sure. But this type of ascent doesn't happen. It just doesn't. And which is why seeing this today was a perfect opportunity with 24/7 Sports ranking Coach O behind only Nick Saban and Dabo among the best coaches in college football as a way to illustrate what a meteoric, a seismic shift has happened in the last 3 years. But also to point out that the only two people still ahead of Ed Orgeron are Nick Saban and Dabo Swinney, the only two men that have not only reached the pinnacle, but sustained it. And if there's one question left for Ed Orgeron that some doubters or naysayers have, and I've been asked this in basically every radio interview I've done in this offseason since the championship, and most certainly since the draft when it was abundantly clear that LSU lost a ton of talent. You know the question. Were they a one-year wonder? Was it this perfect storm of this compilation of elite-level talent, a transcendent quarterback who became the first pick in the draft, and this boy wonder wizard offensive genius who was here for 1 year and then used the springboard to the NFL, and does it all come crashing down after? That's what everybody is asking. And I've been pretty clear in my feelings on it. I think what we will see this year is the biggest compliment that we can pay Ed Orgeron, which is his roster management has been on point. There have been years at LSU where they recruited, and I hate to say to star rankings because it's not about the star ranking, but that's just the best way to describe it. They've recruited the players that were just the best players. There was a year where I remember going out on the first day of fall camp, and LSU had something like 11 or 12 scholarship wide receivers, which is just absurd. I mean, that's not good roster management when you look at 1 to 85 and needing to supplement every position on the field. There was a year after Clifton Garrett. Remember the 5-star linebacker Clifton Garrett, when he left school after year one, there was a year when they started camp with more scholarship kickers than linebackers. That's not good roster management. That was the problem, with the benefit of hindsight, that we can look back now during the less years where it seemed like it was a 4-year cycle, right? They won the title in 2007, and then they lulled, right? They lulled in 8 and 9 and built back up in 10, and then 11 they hit again. And then they lulled again, and then 15, it looked like they were ready to charge, and then it ended the way it did, in the month of November. But even still, 16, you had all that talent replenished, and it just didn't work out, and they were ready to move on. But that lull, I don't think happens now. And I've gone into detail about that, but I think the biggest compliment that you could pay Ed Orgeron is we can have this conversation where you say, hey, look, they lost 4 of their top 6 offensive linemen, which is true. But you go into this season not with the cupboard bare. You go into the season with Ingram and Decula starting on the right side, Chasen Hines, who has been a starter for you, Dare Rosenthal, who has started games for you, Cardell Thomas, who is a 5-star, and then you use the transfer market to go get Liam Shanahan, who started 30 games at Harvard. That's your first 6. That's a pretty good first 6. Like, you can win with that. And I think that's the biggest difference. So when people look at LSU and they wonder, was this a situation like with Gene Chizik? He had a transcendent player at quarterback, rode it to a national title. 2 years later, he was fired. Larry Coker at Miami had all of that talent, won a national title, and then couldn't sustain it. The things that went wrong there were roster management. And that's the thing when I look at what Ed Orgeron has done through recruiting, and not just traditional high school recruiting, but the grad transfer market and the transfer market, and I go, he's nailed it, because he's supplemented with spots where you look like they might be deficient. He went and got an offensive lineman and an All-American linebacker this year to supplement spots where they might have been a little deficient, and now those look like strengths. So I don't know if LSU is going to go 15-0 again this year. I would bet that they don't, but I think the expectation has changed now to where you can lose 20 guys to the NFL, and you still expect LSU to be competing at the end of November to be getting to Atlanta and competing for a playoff spot, not competing for the Citrus Bowl. You can go read this if you want to see the whole coaching rankings at 24/7 Sports. I retweeted the link earlier today from 24/7 Sports, and Barton Simmons put it together. Ed Orgeron trailing only Nick and Dabo. Whoa. A repeat this season, not a national championship, but proving you're back. You're still among that upper crust, even after losing all that talent. Would answer any remaining questions that anybody would have about sustainability.